In the Hebrew Scriptures, you have the only culture and tradition in the known world where instead of writing about their conquests, their successes, their victories, their wealth, their power, the greatest heroes, the Hebrew Scriptures talks about the unfaithfulness of the people, the refusal to keep God's commandments, their falling back into sin, their waywardness, their being conquered. There's a certain transparency that goes back to our Hebrew tradition that no other tradition does, right? Most people, they talk about their favorite person or their favorite sports team. They don't talk about their faults, failings, and shortcomings. They only talk about what's good. But the Hebrew tradition is steeped in this idea of honesty and openness because it's the first step toward effective change. If we don't acknowledge the truth of what's broken about us and broken around us, we're never going to be able to move forward. We know now, looking back, that one of the reasons why some of these criminals that wore a collar got away for so long was because, well, we don't want to scandalize the people. Let's keep it quiet. Let's hush it up because we don't want to hurt the church, or we don't want to upset people. And so the truth was hidden, and the criminal continued to act. It happens in our families. Those awkward family get-togethers where your mom or your dad said, don't go near that uncle, or stay away from that cousin. You didn't know why. Maybe later on you found out, but no one talked about it. And maybe there was mental illness, maybe there was addiction, and we tend to keep it quiet or hidden. We don't want to talk. It's upsetting. And hiding in those shadows and allowing the darkness to cover us keeps us from moving forward. Right? If Father Scott never mentioned the needs for changes in the church, the problems we have with aspects of the facilities, or visual reference points of the choir above the altar, if he's, oh no, everything's perfect, everything's beautiful, well then why renovate? Leave it as it is. It's when we're honest about what needs to be fixed, we're honest about what's broken, that we're allowed to then move forward. And tonight I want to start there. To be honest about what's broken, following the Hebrew tradition, and working into the New Testament, as we will see tonight, about personal stories, experiences, frustrations, about the darkness that is real in our church today. Just like we need to fix the leaks in the roof, maybe the HVAC system, just like the choir needs to move from being above the tabernacle somewhere else. What needs fixing in our church? What's broken? What needs repair? How do we see it? How has it impacted us personally? I want to share with you a few examples and then open the mic for you all to share feelings, thoughts, experiences, not to name names. We don't want to commit calumny, which is saying truthful things about people but ruining their reputation. If it's something that should be addressed, we'll help you get to the right person. But to speak about experiences where you've seen that your church, your family, your beloved home has been a cause of great hurt and harm to you personally. I remember I was in college, home for the summer, and I worked at St. Vincent de Paul Catholic Church in Margate, and the pastor was real weird. I did data entry. I was already in college, 20 years old, 19. He was a clinical psychologist, and I knew he was a vocations director many years ago. And when 2002 blew up and I was in seminary, he was one of the first to come up. And he was one of the first and only ones to be criminally charged in spite of the statute of limitations. Because what I learned later was that Father Neil Doherty, as a clinical psychologist, had access to clinical drugs, and he would bring children into the rectory and give them a Coke with drugs in it. And they would pass out, and he would abuse them. And because he did that, one of the few times that we know about, and the kid was under 13, there was no statute of limitations. But at that point, he was so old and sick, the state attorney didn't bother to go through with trial and just left him to be home and homebound until he died. The victims didn't even let him go to justice and be convicted. There are a lot of priests on that front page of the Miami Herald. Some of them I knew. I worked at a parish where it was divided. As a deacon, the beloved pastor after whom the parish hall is named, had 4 accusations against him. And half the church thought it was a conspiracy theory to destroy his reputation, and the other half believed the victims. He was on vacation in the Bahamas with another infamous priest from my archdiocese, and we read that and they were both removed from ministry while this was being investigated, and we learned in the Miami Herald that one of them was found dead in their bedroom. Christmas Eve. You know, rumors swirled. Did he kill himself? Was it really a heart attack or a stroke? That's a coincidence. We don't know. And the longer I've been a seminarian and the longer I've been a priest, the more I see. Right? As you get older in your family, you start recognizing, you know what? That uncle that was kind of strange, I think he was an alcoholic. Right? As you get older, you get more, you think back on childhood memories and stuff, and you realize, oh, things are a bit more broken than I remember or that I could have understood as a child. We see that, and that's certainly true. When I was in seminary, the horror stories I won't get into of things that I saw and heard and things that happened to me. And you know, the temptation is to say, well, I don't have anything to do with this anymore. But because my reason for being in the seminary was not just because of a priest who was a father figure or only because of John Paul II, but because I knew the Lord and I knew his voice and I knew his gaze and I knew his will, every time I experienced these scandals and these hurts, it drew me closer to him. Lord, I don't want to be like them. I want to be like you. And there were many times that I was in the chapel in tears. Lord, thank you that I was safe from Father Neil Doherty. I thank you that I didn't know these priests as a child. You know, and then as a priest, I would hear from people of their experiences decades ago of abuse at the hands of priests or lay people in the church or other Catholics or family members, and you just cry with them. You know, there is a real darkness in our church. It is broken in profound and powerful ways. And Pope Francis was right to thank the journalists for their work. The movie Spotlight, I think, was very well done. You know, for a time, our temptation was to say, well, they're persecuting us. It's all a lie. Right? Some of it may be. I know priests that were falsely accused. One Nicaraguan priest that I know, a very good man, falsely accused. And I saw him years later. The police investigated it. They found out it was a complete fabricated lie. But he was on the front page. Father Orlando Castillo, guilty until proven innocent, right, of sexually abusing this teenage boy. They went through the whole process. The police and the diocese found there was no credibility to the accusation. And I saw him years later coming to Mass as a layperson, dressed like you. I'm like, Orlando, hey, when are you coming back? He said, I can't. How do I come back? I was on the front page for weeks. I was guilty. And when I was exonerated, it was page 23 in the Miami Herald in the bottom corner. When they see me and they Google my name, they're going to just think, oh, that pedophile got off. So he went back to Nicaragua, and to my knowledge, he never returned to priestly ministry again. It does happen. There are lies. But I think we want to presume on innocence, but also believe the victims, especially children. And so our temptation was, well, I have to protect the church. I have to defend the church. Well, that's not accurate, or that's not true, but then there's this. And the first step to healing is, and to be a missionary discipleship, is this loving, active, attentive listening. I want to hear your story. I believe you. Whether I agree with you or not, whether I had a different experience than you with the same person or not, whether my experience was a complete opposite of yours, one of the first steps to healing as a family and as a person of faith is just to lovingly and actively listen. I hear you. I believe you. You matter to me. That's something that's really missing among us Catholics. We're quick to catechize. We'll teach them the faith, have them learn the catechism, have them memorize a prayer. Yeah, but who listened to them to begin with? Did you let them speak? Did you let them talk about their experience? Did you hear them out? Did you allow them to open their hearts to you? and treat that with reverence and respect without contradicting, correcting, or responding by informing them otherwise. That's the first step. That's how we open the doors to the rest of the world, including ourselves. A lot of times people will meet with me and they'll unload something and expect me to react or respond. And I'll just listen. And they're like, well, aren't you going to say anything? I'm like, well, I'm listening. I think you should be heard. If you have questions, you want me to say something, I'm happy to respond, but I think right now what's most important is that you know that I hear you. That whether we agree or not, whether you're saying things that are contrary to the church's teachings or not, I want you to know that you're loved, and that your opinion matters, and your experience is true and real to you. And I respect and reverence that. So tonight I want to give an opportunity. We have our mic runner, Rita, if you would, just for us to share, not naming names, not specifics, but to share experiences and feelings that have impacted you as a Catholic growing up. Maybe it was a priest, Father, can I have 1 minute for confession? I don't have time for you. Make an appointment. Move. Right? Maybe it was, how you were treated after a divorce. Maybe it was an experience your kids had, and now they're not coming back to church. And a parishioner this morning tell me, this priest couldn't accommodate my daughter for this in her wedding, and she got so upset she hasn't been back since. Maybe it could have been handled differently. What are some of your experiences? What's has been your experience of darkness in the church as a Catholic? Just sharing briefly, not giving specific details of names or necessarily place, but does anyone want to share how and allow yourself to acknowledge the darkness that you've experienced in some way? Just by a show of hands, how many of you going to confession had a negative experience, have had that before? How many of you have encountered a really angry priest or nun that was really uncharitable to you at some point in your life? A lot of hands going up. How many of you were read the riot act by a holy woman in church at some point because you went to Holy Hour, daily mass, or you're at some event and they just ripped into you with the love of Jesus? Have I ever had that? The scary holy women. How many of you have felt deeply saddened and discouraged by the news that have come out in the last 20 years? How many of you have questioned why you're still Catholic? Yes, we've all had similar experiences, and I want to walk with you through the New Testament. Examples of how these scandals are nothing new. And when I highlight this fact, it's not to diminish your experiences. It is not to diminish the scandals of today, but it's just to give context. A lot of people will say, look at how the Vatican, blew these millions of dollars and bought that $100-something million building in London, and now they're selling it for tens of millions of dollars less, and all that money was collected to give to the poor. What a scandal. And I think, yes, it is. But I also read the scriptures, and Judas did the same thing. Wasn't with as much money, but nothing new under the sun. I think when we allow ourselves to really look at the scriptures, we realize that that's not to diminish what's happened today. None of the apostles abused children, but that brokenness has always been a part of our church, even by those chosen by Christ himself. And so walk with me through some of these examples in the Gospels. We see the faults and failings of the apostles in general over and over again. Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke chapter 9, reveals that he's going to be handed over and condemned. And the apostles respond by arguing over who's the greatest among them. Well, when he's dead, who's going to be the leader then? I mean, can you imagine? It's like you coming home to your children and saying, kids, I've got some hard news to tell you. I have terminal cancer. And they start fighting over who's going to get your car. At the Last Supper, Jesus reveals that someone will betray him. And the apostles get caught up arguing over who will be the greatest after he's gone. This intimate meal. So one among you will betray me. And instead of worrying about who is it and how to stop it, they're worried about, well, who's going to be in charge? Then Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to, quote, remain with me and keep watch in prayer, to accompany Jesus in his profound sorrow in the Garden of Olives, and they fall asleep. He wakes them up and asks them again, and they fall asleep. And he wakes them up and asks them again, and they fall asleep. Notice he never comes back and yells at them, like maybe we did to our kids when they fell asleep in Mass. I don't think my mom ever did, even though I habitually slept in Mass as a kid. Then Jesus is arrested, and when he's arrested, all the disciples run. All the apostles abandon him at the cross except for John. 3 years with these men. They saw him raise the dead, cure the blind, heal the leper, multiply the fish and loaves, walk on water, calm the storm and the sea. And on the cross, no one's there but John. The apostles don't understand him. Philip still doesn't know that when he sees Jesus, he sees the Father in John chapter 14. Philip, have you been with me for this long, and you still do not know me? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. John 14, 5-14. Then the disciples of Christ refused to believe in his teachings on the Eucharist. John chapter 6, verse 66. It's not a coincidental numerical association. And it says, as a result of this, many of his disciples returned to their former way of life and no longer accompanied him. Over the Eucharist, nothing new. And then Jesus foretells his passion, but they understood nothing of this, quote unquote. This word remained hidden from them, and they failed to comprehend what he said. Luke 18, 31-34. How many times have you tried to explain the faith to a loved one or your children? Or we've tried to explain the faith at Mass or in religious ed, and people just don't get it. And then we get to the specific apostles. Poor doubting Thomas, right? Thomas doesn't understand when Jesus says, our friend Lazarus is asleep, and I'm going to awaken him. And Thomas says, well, that's great, Lord, he'll get to heaven. And Jesus has to say, Thomas, Lazarus is dead. Oh, that's not good. Thomas doesn't get it, right? And then at his doubting, it's graphic and vulgar. Thomas graphically and vulgarly refuses to believe in the resurrection. Christ appears to them. Thomas, for some reason, isn't there. And just think about how vulgar. Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger into the nail marks and my hand into his side, I will not believe. Imagine how that must have broke John. John's like, Thomas, how could you say that? You weren't even there. I saw and watched them put the nails in his hand. I heard him scream when they drove the nails through his feet. I stood there and was covered in his blood as they pierced his side. Lungs filled with blood and fluid. It sprayed on me. And you're going to say that? You weren't even there. And then Judas Iscariot. Judas was stealing money throughout the 3 years of Jesus' public ministry. It's John chapter 12, verses 1-6. Go back and look at these scripture passages. Our church was broken from the beginning, and Christ chose them personally, sinners that they are and they were. And then the suicide of Judas. There's two versions. I think a lot of Catholics don't know this. First, in Matthew 27, 3-5, the version is that he hung himself. Quote, then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that Jesus had been condemned, deeply regretted what had been done. He returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? Look to it yourself. Flinging the money into the temple, he departed and went off and hanged himself. A bishop committing suicide. Just today or yesterday, Pope Francis accepted the resignation of the Archbishop of Paris because of a relationship he was having with a woman, and potentially because of how he was treating his priests. There's a second version of Judas' suicide in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1, verse 15-18, where he jumps off a cliff. Imagine a bishop committing suicide. Judas did. And then we get to Peter, the Pope, the head of the apostles, the one to whom Jesus gave the keys. Peter does not understand the vision of the Transfiguration. He sees Moses and Elijah and Jesus. Lord, we'll make 3 tents, one for each of you. It's like, Peter, we're going to Jerusalem. I told you I'm going to be crucified and killed. Just come with me. He wants to stay there. No, I like this better. Let's not go to Jerusalem. Let's stay up here on this mountain, and maybe Elijah and Moses will come back. And then Peter refuses to accept the will of the Father, that Jesus should be arrested and killed. You remember he had to tell him in Mark chapter 8, "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." Again, when Peter's arrested, he's the only one that responds by not running away. But he doesn't respond in the right way. He pulls out his sword and he cuts the ear of one of the servants. Jesus heals the man. And then, of course, we all know about Peter's threefold denial. And when he denies Jesus, right after Mass, he curses. The Gospels of Luke and Mark tell us that he cursed, saying all kinds of swear words. I do not beep, 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 know the man. Peter denies him 3 times, cursing and swearing, as I said. Luke 22:54-62 says, "At that he began to curse and to swear. I do not know the man." And immediately the cock crowed. So the Scriptures are full of honesty and transparency about the brokenness of the first founders of our church, the ones that Jesus chose, not some sinful bishop, some sinful pope. It was Christ himself called each of these men. He had to have known their brokenness. He had to have known their sins. But he called them anyway. "Follow me. I will make you fishers of men." And following the Hebrew tradition and the New Testament tradition, we have to be open and honest as well if we're ever going to heal and move forward. And so the Archdiocese of Denver, unlike most any other diocese in the country, actively cooperated and initiated this independent review report that you remember came out a couple years ago. We thought it was bad, and that was before COVID and the elections. But they went back 50 years. And you know, the review and the report said our worst priest was one of the pastors here, St. Peter, Larry St. Peter, right? And they believe that he, when he ran the diocese in between bishops, destroyed some of his files. So there's no evidence of other things he probably did. But that honesty and transparency with the civil authorities and with Catholics and people of goodwill allows us to move forward with healing. To be open, to be honest, to be transparent. Only when we do that can we be renewed. And we'll get to that tomorrow with how confession is a personal way of living that out, to be able to move forward. So the scandals of the successors of the apostles and their clergy is nothing new in history. But the 3 dioceses of Colorado cooperated, committed to reparation and transparency and better practices and to implement safety measures for all. We're not there yet. But people are deeply hurt in a Catholic way when they're scandalized by Christians, in ways that they're not with police and teachers. You know, people will hear about or experience a priest, a pope, a bishop, a religious sister, or a Catholic mistreat them. That's why I'm never going to be a Catholic again. But then they hear or experience a police officer abuse their power, and they don't say, "I don't believe in democracy. It should be anarchy. We shouldn't have police." Or they have a horrible experience with a teacher, or a teacher abuses a student. You don't hear people say, "We should do away with education. I'm not going to school ever again because of that one experience." But when they have that experience in the church, that's often their reaction. And they're hurt in a very Catholic way, in part because we should do better. But we realize we're just as broken as anyone else. So we can become overwhelmed and overcome by the details of the sins we read about, the sins we've experienced ourselves, or from others, the sins we've heard about. And we can get focused on these scandals. I mean, I remember in 2002 and reading through the report that came out here in Colorado, and the obscene, repugnant, putrid details of how children were abused here in Colorado, or when that Pennsylvania report came out. I mean, it was I don't have words for how I wanted to throw up. And I had to stop. Because those images come to your head and you get stuck on them. And that darkness consumes you. And we don't want to deny. We cannot ignore and we cannot obfuscate the evil. But we don't want to stay there. So tonight, Jesus is inviting us to be consumed not by the darkness, but by his grace. The light has shone in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Those were John's words. Why? Because John saw the darkness with his own eyes. He's alone of the 12 apostles and of all the authors of the New Testament. He alone watched God take his last breath. He alone took the lifeless body of Jesus. No one else of the New Testament, not Luke, Mark, took the lifeless body down from the cross and put it in a tomb. The light has shone in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. He knew the darkness of that tomb. He helped roll the stone to close it. John suffered the passion of Christ, the church fathers would say, more than all the martyrdoms of all the other apostles combined. He was the only apostle not to be martyred. But I'm sure he would tell you, I prefer to have been crucified upside down like Peter, or skinned alive like Bartholomew, or Andrew, crucified, than to go through what I went through for 3 hours at the foot of the cross of Jesus with Mary in my arms. And that's why there's this theological movement to promote Mary as co-redemptrix, though there has been a lot of concern about the English use of that word, because no one else suffered with Jesus more than Mary. This is her only child, her only son. The darkness has shone, but the light has overcome it. And so tonight, as we transition to this holy hour, we want to acknowledge the darkness without being consumed by it, by focusing on the face of Jesus that shines in the darkness, so that we can walk over the turbulent waters to the safe harbor of his arms. The bark of Peter is in very, very rough waters. And it's not just because the waters and the winds outside are bad. It's also because those steering the bark are doing a terrible job. You know, you can live and die on the boat, not based on weather conditions, but just based on who's driving it. You know, I've been on some boats in Key West, and it's amazing how easy it can be to flip it or to fall out of it if the person driving the boat doesn't do it properly. And how uncomfortable I've been with people that don't know what they're doing, and sick I can get on a boat versus someone who knows what they're doing, and they can go with the waves and with the current, and they know how to get through more smoothly. It's not just that we're being persecuted. It's not just that people hate us because we're Catholic. We're also broken. We've also done wrong. We've also hurt others and been hurt by those who claim to follow Christ. Listen to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verse 24 to 33. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once, Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Because I'm walking on water and I shouldn't be? Because there's waves? Because it's stormy and raining and there's wind? But I'm here. I'm with you. Why aren't you looking at me? Notice the reason why Peter begins to sink is because he took his eyes off of Jesus. And he looked at the waves and the storm and the water and the dark shadows swimming underneath him. He took his eyes off of Jesus. All of those things are real. All of those bad things were happening, but he took his eyes off of Jesus. After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, it's saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Christ is speaking to you and I today as we acknowledge the darkness out there and in our church. The sufferings, the scandals, the disappointments, the personal hurts. We're terrified. We're terrified for our country. We're terrified for our church. We're terrified for our children and grandchildren who aren't even Catholic. Where is their hope now? What about their salvation? What did I do wrong? What could I have done better? We're haunted by these fears, genuine fears for ourselves and for those we love, as they're mired in sin and hopelessness, as we keep messing up, and as we try to bring them back, and the people we bring them to end up only hurting them more. Tonight, as we come before the Blessed Sacrament, I want to invite you, together with me, to do a holy hour of reparation. Reparation for our sins, reparation for the sins in the church, a reparation for all those who have been hurt by people who are Catholic, the scandals they've read about, the scandals they've experienced. Tonight, instead of being consumed by the darkness, I want to invite you to be consumed by his grace. So as we take this 6 minutes, 7 minutes to transition to our holy hour, I just want to invite you to hear this song. It's sung by an author that's titled "Consumed by Grace," and she uses the words and lyrics of St. Teresa of Avila's prayer. It's a 6-minute song. We'll lower the lights, we'll prepare the altar and the candles for this holy hour. We'll offer the Chaplet of Divine Mercy in a way that is sung so that it is prayerful and rhythmic. Just invite you to close your eyes, sit or kneel, and to hear the words of this song and Christ inviting you to not be afraid. That he could speak to your heart as he did to Peter in the chaos of the ocean, the waves around him, the chaos of our church, our country, our family. Can you see his face? Can you allow the light to dispel the darkness? Can you allow yourself not to be consumed by the darkness, but instead consumed by his grace?
Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing affright you. All things Come